Hi, and welcome to our event. I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Reynard, who is going to be giving a fantastic presentation about Disney princesses, what's wrong, what's right, what's going on. We have a lot of attendees today, so thank you guys for joining us. Just a reminder, if you guys have any questions, you can throw them in the Q&A, and we will be answering them towards the end of the event. And we look forward to hearing everything that you have to ask. So please feel free to participate. We encourage that. And the production will be recorded and we'll be adding it to our YouTube page. So if you are able to stick around, we hope you will. And we look forward to hearing from you. So take it away.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you everybody for organizing this so nicely and so professionally. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you, prospective students or already admitted students. In this case, I want to congratulate you. I also want to welcome the parents that may have been interested in seeing what Stony Brook class is or what this class in particular is about. And so I'll be delighted to share with you all some of my expertise. I'm Dr. Reynard Leroy, and my specialty is fairy tale studies. And I'll be talking to you today about Disney princess films and what may be wrong, as Jacqueline said, or right, or what's going on with Disney princesses. It looks like you're all interested in hearing about it, and I'll be curious to hear what you have to say after I raise a few questions for you. So researchers have long found that there's a major problem with Disney princess movies, and not just with the good old classic ones that the feminists have argued against for their representations of women as passive and voiceless. In brief, damsels in distress in need of rescue by a Prince Charming. We'll see that later Disney films that we've thought of as progressive in those areas may still be problematic. So we'll start with The Little Mermaid as a case study to show that paradox. In 1989, Disney finally released The Little Mermaid. They had been thinking about it since the 1930s, right after Sleeping Beauty. And that was also after 30 years of absence in the princess movie line. The last one was precisely Sleeping Beauty in 1959, sorry. And though a masterpiece to us now in retrospect, it flopped and nearly got the Disney studios bankrupt. So when Disney did that in '89, critics praised this modern new heroine, Ariel, for her modern qualities. Unlike her predecessor, she seemed like a fully realized female character who thinks and acts independently, even rebelliously. The New York Times called her a spunky daredevil. And yet, in one respect, The Little Mermaid, even back then, represented a backward step in the princess genre. Indeed, for a film centered on a young woman, there is a lot of talking by men. In fact, a linguistic study that was conducted right after the movie was released shows that this was the first Disney princess movie, in odd contrast with the old classic ones, in which the men significantly outspoke the women. And it actually started a trend. The plot of The Little Mermaid, of course, involves Ariel literally losing her voice. So one can wonder why Disney chose that disempowering fairy tale from the 19th century. But in the few Disney princess movies that followed, Beauty and the Beast in 91, Aladdin in 92, Pocahontas in 95, Mulan in 98, the women speak even less. On average, in those films, men have 3 times as many lines as women, as that linguistic study I mentioned earlier shows. So I'll use The Little Mermaid to explore how Disney operates in circulating dominant gender representations through stereotypical heteronormative characters, namely with the character of Ursula, the villain Ursula the villain, Eric the prince, Ariel the protagonist, and her father's Triton. The construction of gender roles and ideologies usually starts from a young age, both by societal norms and by an early exposure to mass media. Classic fairy tales, either in their original form or the mass production of them, create some of the first expectations of gender roles. Taking into account the level of media consumption from an early age in the media-savvy cultures which is ours, a large corporation such as Disney plays a huge part in constructing society's gender roles. The Walt Disney Corporation has been one of the most successful multinational mass media corporations since 1923, and the largest media conglomerate in the world in terms of revenue. Disney has made some of the most successful animated movies, with the majority of them following the same principles based on stereotypes. These stereotypical storyline characters exist in a majority of Disney films, with The Little Mermaid being no exception. Princess Ariel and the villain Ursula, as in many films, can be easily identified by audiences and be labeled as protagonists or antagonists from the beginning of the movie. And the two dominant males create a competition for achievement and success, as Ariel is forced in a way to choose between her father, King Triton, and her love, Prince Eric, when she makes the decision to live on land. Furthermore, Ariel choosing between the two men reinforces the dominant ideology of men in power, obtaining a trophy wife, thus objectifying women and minimizing their role as a status symbol for successful men. The negative female representations and dominant gender ideologies are further reinforced in the villain's song called Poor Unfortunate Souls. When closely studying the lyrics of the songs, verses such as "This one longing to be thinner, that one wants to get the girl," stand out, as Ursula gives the example of an overweight woman and a skimpy-looking man whose way to happiness is Ursula turning the girl thin and giving the man muscles, thus reinforcing the ideology of how the physical characteristics of the two genders should be in order to be happy. Furthermore, the other verse of the song that stands out is, "The men up there don't like a lot of blubber. It's she who holds her tongue who gets the man." The verse supports that women should not talk or express their opinion and be overall submissive in order to be attractive for the man. With the addition of the verse, "You'll have your looks, your pretty face, and don't underestimate the importance of body language. Ha!" One can notice that the film emphasizes that the most important part of a woman is not her brains or personality, but rather her appearance and body, with the female sexuality as the only form of power for a woman. However, although the heroes reinforce dominant ideologies and present the gender ideal, the villains in Disney movies often represent certain minority groups in an exaggerated negative way. In the theme of racial stereotyping, it is said that there are 4 stereotypical representations of persons of color: humorous, exotic, petite, or dangerous. The villain of the film, Ursula, is the only character that is not presented as Caucasian, as she has a dark purple skin color. The difference in skin tone between villains and heroes can be seen in various Disney classics. For example, in The Lion King, the villain Scar has a dark brown mane and darker hair color than the rest of the lions. The darker skin tones of villains could be a negative representations of non-Caucasians as dangerous. So to my audience who's listening to me, I want you to think about whether you have other examples of this stereotypes in other Disney movies for the Q&A. Furthermore, Ursula's character is based on the drag queen divine, thus queer-coded. Ursula's character creates gender trouble in the patriarchal nature of the film, in the sense that she's the only character of the film that is not part of the dichotomized and binary view of gender. While her inclusion in the film could be viewed as a positive addition, she's clearly presented as the villain, and therefore she passes the idea that any non-binary or gender-fluid person is bad and can't be a hero. In the LGBT register, Jafar from Aladdin is another villainous character that can be easily queered, and so is Scar from The Lion King. The latter two villains, Jafar and Scar, being the creations of an openly gay artist who admitted in interviews that he was inspired by his own sexuality when drawing these characters, so as to give them more theatrality and elegance. It's not just queer coding for the sake of doing it here. But the fact is, research shows that many of Disney villains have been indeed analyzed as queer. And I would like to the audience again to think of perhaps others in other Disney movies, others than the one that I've just mentioned. Many of the above stereotypes and dominant ideologies are often continuously recirculated in Disney films, and as one could argue, not by random chance. The aspect of age as intersecting with gender also needs to be added in this discussion about Disney's stereotypes in representations. For example, we can find in Disney numerous female villainesses who exhibit several of the negative stereotypes of aging, bartering everything for the sake of eternal youth, beauty, and social and political power. If we agree that culture mirrors society, we can assert that some of these Disney princess films sadly reflect society's double standard concerning aging. Although Disney has the capacity to alter consciousness about growing older, it has failed in transcending the prejudices against female aging characters in particular. Older women are either backgrounded as loving, preferably deceased mothers. It's the case with Cinderella's mom. Or if powerful and independent, vilified as evil femme fatale, thinking of Cruella or the evil queen in Snow White, or ugly hags, as in Snow White. In The Little Mermaid, similar to the evil queen in Snow White, half a century earlier, Disney's Ursula is still portrayed as an old woman obsessed with youth and beauty. Not only does she use Ariel's melodious voice as her own, but she transforms herself into a beautiful princess, a replica of Ariel, in an attempt to trick the prince to marry her. She not only strives for youth and beauty, but also for usurping the Sea King and becoming the queen. Ursula's brief success to seize King Triton's crown and scepter, and her growing to gigantic, fearsome proportions is accompanied by her reciting, "I am the ruler of all the oceans. The waves obey my every whim. The sea and all its spoils bow to my power." Given the patriarchal context of the film that we have been describing, her words could be considered heresy, punishable by death. When compared to the evil queen in Snow White and the wicked stepmother in Cinderella, Disney's Ursula could be seen as one of the most hideous aging females. As a critic put it bluntly, quote, "Ursula, disgustingly obese female form, whose upper body is that of a sumo wrestler, a lower body of a frightening octopus, is contrasted with Ariel's delicate auburn-haired beauty. Ursula's hair is wild and white, another indicator of old age. Her lips are large and red. Her skin is purplish, and her voice is masculine. Ursula, therefore, represents the power-hungry stereotype, in contrast to the wise and kind Sea King, who, despite his old age, represented in his long white hair and beard, is still physically fit and handsome." End of quote. Such hunger for power could be viewed as a desperate attempt to regain what power the witch lost together with her youth. Physically, Ursula's old age is reflected in her oversized body that stands in open contrast to Ariel's slim physique. By associating weight with evil, in one scene, Ursula's huge breasts fill the entire screen. Ursula's grabbing tentacles and manipulative personality reflect Disney's characterization of older women as huge, predatory villains. When in the source text by Hans Christian Andersen, the sea was nearly a matriarchy with a queen mother a king, and many princesses, Disney's world only shows the negative side of feminine rule and the positive side of masculine rule. In conclusion to our case study of The Little Mermaid, one could say that although both men and women are capable of turning into villains, it is usually women, especially the older ones, who are branded as evil villainesses in many of Disney's works. There are no mature female beauties in those films who can rival in screen time with those villainesses. So yes, we do need heroines who not only possess intelligence and are not just desperately waiting to be rescued by a handsome prince, which to some extent have been worked on these past few years with the latest princess movies featuring strong young heroines. But we also need to see some who are not afraid of aging, or who've aged wisely and beautifully. I'll now tackle another major problem in Disney films. I've talked about racial stereotypes at its intersection with gender earlier. And now I would like to discuss the case of those foreign princess movies and the racial and cultural stereotypes that come with them. In 1998, Disney released Mulan, claiming that Chinese culture had been thoroughly researched, so much so that this picture could be understood as an authentic slice of ancient Chinese history. It's Disney's first attempt to draw on an Asian story, though they had adapted numerous folk tales and legends at that point, and it draws from an old Chinese poem from the 4th or 5th century, the Ballad of Mulan, that thousands of Chinese children can recite, as it is requisite in many standardized textbooks in Chinese elementary schools. By adapting a socially significant and still eminent text, Disney was taking a huge risk with the Chinese market. The fact is that the film failed at the box office in China. What Disney did with Mulan is appropriating certain elements of Chinese culture and completely eliminating or changing essential aspects of the original ballad, another poor decision on their part. Indeed, Disney's Mulan contains countless misrepresentations of important elements of Chinese culture. I'll give a few examples here. One, the matchmaker interview ritual that Mulan and all women in China must endure did not exist in feudal China. By including this matchmaker's ritual, the film pits Mulan against the strict tradition of Chinese culture, even though this ceremony was not included in the original text or within ancient China altogether. In Disney's appropriation, Chinese culture was even ridiculed as strictly preventing girls from achieving their non-traditional potentials, a scenario regularly used to depict non-Western cultures in Disney films of the period. 2. The Huns are erroneously depicted as Mongols in the film. They were actually a Turkic people. In relation to the time period of the ballad, they were an Uyghur tribe from northern Wei. So making all people from the East one homogeneous nation or making them all interchangeable is not only pedagogically wrong, but it is also offensive to those whose heritage is misrepresented. 3. The sacred and mighty dragon symbol is reduced to Mushu, a comical lizard voiced by the American actor and comedian Eddie Murphy. That he is named after a common Chinese dish, Mushu pork, which would be familiar to American audiences, further denounces the royal cultural symbolism of the dragon. It totally trivializes it. 4. In the original Ballad of Mulan, Mulan received the blessing of her parents to leave, who both understand that her father is not fit to go to war. Disney drastically departs from this narrative detail as Mulan steals her father's armor and sword and escapes into the dark of night. While this may seem like a small discrepancy, Mulan's direct disobedience of her father's wishes in the animated version is significant due to familial relations and order being of the utmost importance within traditional Chinese culture. 5. In addition, Mulan would not have had to cut her hair to blend in with the other male warriors, as after childhood, men and women both were wore their hair long, so she would have easily fit in with the other male soldiers, especially in bulky and ornate battle gear. Disney should not have applied to Western belief that women's long hair is an ultimate symbol of femininity. 6. Furthermore, regarding imprecise translations, it would be ludicrous for Mulan to name her horse Can, as that title was reserved only for the emperor, who is referred to in the original ballad as the Khan. No other person, let alone an animal, could ever be hallowed with such a monumental designation. 7. The film's suggestion that Mulan could not conform to the stereotypical roles society attributed to women was false as well. The first lines of the poem suggest that Mulan was fully qualified to complete the domestic work traditionally assigned to Chinese women of the period, and would have never felt out of place, as she does in the film. I will never pass as a perfect bride or a perfect daughter, Mulan sings in reflection. Another misrepresentation of ancient culture, a Chinese culture vis-a-vis gender expectations. In the ballad, Mulan happily and easily returns to her domestic duties once back to her family after her years of fighting. And finally, 8. The ballad states that Mulan fought hundreds of battles for her country over 12 years, earning promotions in rank because of her dedication and skill. She was not found out until after the war was over, and even if her gender was discovered during the war, she would not have been killed as Disney's Mulan claims. There were other female generals and brave soldiers in Chinese history, and women were sanctioned to serve in the army. Instead of 12 years of distinguished combat, Mulan's transformation from a neophyte soldier into an authority on all forms of mortal combat in the film is represented through the common Hollywood technique of a training montage. What we can draw from these examples, I'll borrow it from a critic who said, by ignoring the internal diversity of Chinese culture and inaccurately representing Chinese and other Asian cultures, Disney essentially portrays non-Western cultures as monolithic others and perpetuates the racial hierarchy. End of quote. This preparation montage, like this 8 transformation I just mentioned, has become known as what scholars popularly define as Disneyfication. This Disneyfication process is able to transform any text, that is cultural material, into the European fairy tale formula that they have become famous for. Favoring a Eurocentric vision that is presented by cultural outsiders, Disney makes the conscious decision that they will forego culturally authentic aspects of the original text and use their proven method to pursue another box office success. This exploitation of treasured stories and tales from culturally rich societies and civilizations for profit is a troubling form of adaptation, and unfortunately has often been abused by Disney over the last several decades. Though there are many instances of positive cross-cultural communication, including the children's book, which is said to have inspired Disney's Mulan, Disney's films give rise to cultural hybridization and intercultural conflicts. For instance, with Arabs in the case of Aladdin in 1992, with Africans in the case of The Lion King, 1994, with Native Americans for Pocahontas, 1995, with the African American community for The Princess and the Frog, 2009. In these instances, Disney is not fostering fruitful social cultural connection. Instead, it is simply exploiting these various texts for financial gains. At the same time, Disney is also appropriating non-Western materials, taking advantage of the exotic appeal of the other, abstracting them out of the cultural milieus and framing them within a Western ideological culture. In the case of Mulan, from a political economic standpoint alone, Disney has exploited the powerful girl image that had been created as a product of the profit-driven practice in the media industry to take financial advantage of the growing female market. Mulan's 98 release was the one of the final adaptations of a cultural tale during Disney's Renaissance, an era which began with The Little Mermaid in 1989 and concluded with Tarzan 1999. This period, often referred to as New Disney by cinema scholars, marked a distinct positioning of Disney as a defender of Western values against an evil other. The original opening soundtrack to Aladdin with the lyrics, "Where the caravan camels roam, where they cut off your ear, if they don't like your face, it's barbaric, but hey, it's home," establishes the setting of the fictional Middle Eastern city of Agrabah as dangerous and uncivilized. These lyrics, altered only after the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee voiced its concern with the bigoted lines, still contained the lines, "It's barbaric, but hey, it's home," setting up the dichotomy between Western and Eastern civilization. Additionally, Disney routinely exploits arranged marriage scenarios in which the woman has no agency, obfuscating traditional American values with feminism in many animated features of this period. Whereas Aladdin's Jasmine refuses to marry a suitor set up by her father, the Sultan, eventually wedding the story's former street urchin, Aladdin, Pocahontas similarly denies her father, Chief Powhatan's wishes to wed the serious warrior Kocoum in favor of forming a relationship with the Jamestown settler John Smith. Though not marketing these features around its cultural research and commitment to authenticity, in regularly discounting important details from these stories or disregarding historical accounts, Disney deliberately pits American principles of democracy against the traditional cultures depicted in each of these films. When integrated with the various generalized stereotypes and unfavorable social characterizations, these earlier works of the era further reinforced the cultural misappropriation clearly present in Mulan and targeted at its primarily American audiences. In conclusion, I'll say that the Walt Disney Pictures have been a part of audiences' life from a young age, with what, although at first glance, seems like harmless fairy tales. However, as we've just seen, when taking a deeper look, one can find many subliminal messages in the songs and characters that enhance and even create an idea, a norm, of how a person should or shouldn't look or act like. If one argue that regressive representations such as the damsels in distress have improved with films like Frozen, where the heroine saves herself, ideologies such as the perfect beauty ideal or the Barbie model, the macho man, or the lack of non-binary gender representations are still predominant, if not persistent, despite progressions happening in other sectors of media and entertainment. On the question of intersection between race and gender, Disney in recent years has done a better job portraying women and characters of colors and is somewhat able to write a story without harming the image of another population, as seen in movies like Moana in 2016, where there was no evil group of Samoans, unlike the Huns in Mulan, and Moana herself does not fit into the Barbie mold. Anyone has seen Raya yet? Well, so far so good in terms of success at the domestic and overall global box office, despite its streaming format only. However, the first criticism being heard are precisely about the lack of representation of the target culture, South Asia. There's only one actor of South Asian descent in the film, all the others being East Asian, which raises the other issue we've raised earlier with Mulan of treating Asians as a monolith. Raya is supposed to be Disney's first Southeast Asian princess movie. Mulan was East Asian, specifically Chinese. East Asia being represented by the big China, Korea, Japan triangle. And yet it adopts a melting pot approach, mixing elements of Vietnam, Thailand, Laos. I'm talking about Raya. And as one South Asian critic denounced on NPR, those types of Asians are typically viewed by American, post-Vietnam War, as the jungle Asians, with their skin being darker than East Asians, etc. So the issues of misrepresentations we've raised in this talk about older Disney films featuring foreign cultures seem to persist. Moana, in that sense, did a much better job at representing Pacific Islanders culture because of a deep engagement of insiders in the filmmaking. Did Disney take a lighter approach and regress with Raya in this particular aspect? I invite you to go and watch it with a critical eye and see for yourselves. So this is the end of my talk, and I would like to now invite the audience to ask me a question or to reflect on a few of these ideas that I have shared with you and see if they might think about example of these phenomena in most recent Disney movies that you may have seen. Example of sexism, of ageism, of racism, or racial stereotypes, or of cultural inaccuracies, or ableism, bigotry, or perhaps some other problems you may have seen or felt that I haven't evoked in this talk today.
Great, thank you so much. We do have some questions. We got some feedback. Honestly, this was a fantastic talk. So I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. So this is my daughter's crying. I'm gonna have someone else ask a question.
Maybe because of what I said about the Disney princesses.
Sure. Hi, Sophie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, we have some really great comments from students. One student mentioned that when they first sketched out Elsa, they made Elsa the villain and gave her dark, spiky hair. As Elsa got better, her hair got lighter. I didn't know that. Did you hear about that?
No, I didn't, and that's why I really want to invite the audience to participate, in particular about the later movies, because the problem with the later movies is that they're so recent that there has been less work done on them. So to go back to Elsa, I'm not surprised at all. I have noticed myself in my discussion with the students in the current Disney course that I teach, that the colors seem to vary even during the movies, depending on the circumstances. But I'm not surprised to hear this about Elsa, because in the process of filmmaking, they might have done some marketing studies, or they might have received some negative comments, and so they had to address those. It seems that it's the common attitude of Disney to be actually receptive to criticism. It just takes a very long time to be addressed, and it feels also that once it's addressed, it's a little too late, because then they commit other mistakes that they then have to address a little later. But to be fair to them, they do take that into consideration. The big question being whether they do that because of their real concern of not offending people, or simply because they want they don't want to upset their audience, because they want to be successful and have success at the box office. But also I want to say something else about the villains. In the case of the recent films, the villain sometimes, there's more of a gray area. The villain can slightly be so attractive or interesting because of its personality that it could shift a little bit. It's like a spectrum, and be redeemed or become good, which was not at all the case in the classic Disney movie. So I leave it there for that one comment.
I remember when we watched Frozen 2, my daughter always thought that General Matthias, who was Black in the movie, she goes, oh, he's the bad guy. And it's so much ingrained that when people are darker skin, darker hair, that in turn means that they are negative or the bad guy in children's eyes. And it definitely influences the way that they take that. Someone else said that another example of evil portrayed in aging is, of course, Tangled, where Rapunzel's
Mother,
kidnapped mother
yes.
will age if she is not, trying to capture the essence of youth and beauty. And so, of course, that's viewed
Thank
in.
you for this example. Obviously, of course. Um, it also touches on very disturbing elements, but that are the core of fairy tales in general: child neglect, child abuse, etc. Oedipal complex, and you name it.
Lots of dead parents, which is always just so fun to discuss with little children. So there's a lot of great questions here. Why do Disney movies feel the need to make everything Eurocentric as to equal beauty? Even in tales that just depict other nationalities, ethnicities, they still use the Eurocentric features of beauty.
It's true because I'll, for instance, give you the example of in Pocahontas, the Native Americans are featured very, very homogeneously, like their faces do not much differ from each other. They have very angular features, but the Europeans are very well defined. So an exception again, and I like to talk about Moana as being seemingly the exception because the reviews by the culture that was targeted, Pacific Islanders, were actually really positive. People said, oh, finally, people who look like us, these characters actually look like us. And by the way, these stories that are being told, I remember them from what my grandmother was telling me, which was extremely positive feedback, because this is exactly what had been a problem with Mulan. So that's why I don't want to place a judgment on Raya. I'm going to go and see it, but I just don't like this idea of talking about South Asian as one people. And I know the principle behind wanting to be inclusive and making this idea of a melting pot doesn't come from a bad principle, but it is, I am sure, very offensive to Asian, South Asian in particular, to be represented in such a vague way. So I don't understand that, and I don't know why they didn't do their homework as they did it and spend a lot of money in the case of Moana to particularly rectify what they had done in the case of Mulan. So the European thing is to go back on the origins of Disney. Well, Walt Disney is this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant who is the post-Depression era. Of course, his audience was mostly white, and it's the family values of the post-Depression era, very democratic values, the hardworking values, all these white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethics. And so that's at the basis of Disney. It's very hard to go astray from that, because this is the base. Well, talking about globalization, Disney is now a global power. So that's why they have to diversify. But I would say that in the story of Disney, it's relatively recent. And so that's why. So you have to give Disney the chance of getting better at representing other cultures, but they're not there yet. They're trying. And
do you think that they did a good job with Tiana? As many of the comments and questions are referencing.
Oh no, that was very problematic. So we studied the movie Tiana in my class last week during our 2 sessions, and we read really excellent articles written by specialists in Africana studies, or in particular. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of real big faux pas, or they meant very well, but they did not do a very good, it was not strategically very sound. They decided to set up the plot in New Orleans in the 1920s, in the Jim Crow era. So the premise was wrong, because how can you feature the very, very first Black princess in a background of segregation. It's from the beginning, it's problematic. And there's
And
so
then
many.
you don't see her for most of the movie as she is a frog.
So the horror of it
Spoiler
is
alert.
the fact that, yes, I mean, it's the third time they turn, or they make a parallel between a Black character and an animal. They turn that Black character into an animal, or they avoid the issue of race altogether, despite putting it in a heavily racially charged context. They avoid the discussion about race. And one way to avoid it is to turn her into a green frog for 3/4 of the movie. So, as I read, there were testimonies of little girls extremely excited at the idea of going and see a movie that would feature a princess that would finally look like them. And then, within a few minutes, that princess, who, by the way, lives in a ghetto, they would have liked to see her in a real castle, and so on. She's not given the princess treatment, becomes a green frog, and the little girl asking, well, I don't want to see the frog. I want to see, where's the princess? I want to see my Black princess. So that these are my views on, not my views, but what I've read with scholars that have studied the movies, but also with viewers, and especially, I mean, it was most of the African American community felt offended. Mind you, they seem to have done very well with the paraphernalia, because the African American community still wants to have a princess to be able to relate to. So the little girls like to have the object, all the gadgets that feature Tiana, because Tiana in herself is a wonderful character.
Absolutely. And one of the questions on here that's very interesting is they haven't made a movie about a Latinx princess. Do you believe they would make her pan-Latina, spreading across multiples? And it also makes me think of Elena of Avalor, because then there's the Disney Junior representation of a Latina princess, which is Elena. And again, a more generalized caricature, and it's only from a spin-off of Sophia the First, a very white little girl princess.
Oh, you know what? The catch me off guard. I haven't even thought of the fact that this is the elephant in the room. We need a Latina, a princess, and then maybe, after their controversy with The Princess and the Frog, I think it's 2009, if I'm correct. Well, it's been 10 years. We haven't seen another one in an animated movie in a Disney. So I think they may be extremely scared, because there's just a lot at stake. We're talking about like a huge minority, in this country that I don't know. It is it's a great question. But you can imagine how much they would be under scrutiny.
Absolutely.
They have to, but
yes, there's so many things.
I know I see questions about Brave.
I know, I love Brave and her defiance of marriage. But that seems to be kind of the new Disney trend, is okay, well, we're not going to then focus on marriage, since that seems to be like one of the issues, but that's one of a myriad of issues that have been facing the Disney princesses. And so, and with Brave, even at the end, like, she does learn to fight, but she said, I want to, choose my own and fight for that. And it's a fantastic story, but it's Frozen that really has taken the hearts of a lot of young girls, and
Yes.
also shown that it doesn't have to be about marriage. And then in the second one, spoiler, they make it all about marriage, but focusing on Kristoff's journey instead of Anna's, to get her to marry him, and her journey of trying to save Arendelle and her sister. Do you think that they went far enough to kind of take that step away from focus?
Well, this is very typical of Disney in all its studies that I've done of of Disney and its evolution over time. I studied in particular the Cinderella cycle from the classic Cinderella 1950 or 51 to the sequels that were terrible. They were video only sequels. I don't know if anybody has seen Cinderella 2 and Cinderella 3.
Yes, many times recently.
Terrible. Well, so it's really funny because on the one hand, you can say thank you to Disney to have incorporated a lot of the criticism made by feminists about the passiveness of the Cinderella character, etc. So they're really trying to turn this Cinderella into a feminist who's going to, change the lifestyle at the court or so on, or who's going to impose democratic idea about royal marriages, for instance, and then also the villains are always redeemed in the sequels. Have you noticed this trend that the villains tend to be redeemed? So to me, those sequels always appear as attempts at correcting problems, but they never go far enough, or in some cases they regress. They even regress. So in the case of those female characters that are against arranged marriages, which seems to be an obsession with Disney to fight arranged marriages, and then to do without a man, in the end, the marriage seems to always come somehow in a sequel or not, or love. This is their dilemma. I think they're trying to progress with the times, but at the same time, they have to stay true to themselves, to their signature. And let's not forget that fairy tales as a literary genre, or as a genre in general, requires a happy ending, and a happy ending of a fairy tale is a marriage. So it's very hard to deviate from that formula.
Absolutely.
Without disappointing people.
It's interesting though, when I saw Frozen, I was really focused on her battle. Was very much a battle of anxiety and depression, that you could really see her kind of coming to terms with it and how to focus on it, what should she internalize, what should she hold back, who was really her true self. And so it does make a nice thing to be able to talk about things like how to overcome your inner demons and things like that. And it's interesting that you brought up the Cinderella sequels. There's also the Little Mermaid sequels, and someone asked what your thoughts on those were. And I thought it was funny because I have seen both of those many times, as my daughter, who keeps interrupting me, likes to point out. The concept of marriage and then children is so ingrained, and even more so in the sequels, which really tend to only be watched by that younger audience because they want that story to keep going. Do they have that opportunity to take stories that they told in the past and kind of reconfigure them through the sequels, or should they just let them go and start from scratch?
They want to make money. So when you do Frozen and you have the success that you've had, you have to do a Frozen 2, no matter what, even if it's going to be a terrible one, they're going to make money. So we cannot avoid that. But I wish they didn't, because unless it becomes, like, for instance, to me, one big exception is Maleficent. I think Maleficent is absolutely terrific because it's not a dilution of the story. It's not. It's a pure fiction. So it's a real creation on the part of Disney. They're not recycling an old story that might not work in the current context. They're giving another perspective on a very old story. And that's real work. That's smart. That's creative. That was a beautiful film.
Absolutely.
So I
And
wish
little
they were
kids
doing
love
things
villains
like
as
that.
much as they love princesses sometimes. Maleficent is my daughter's favorite villain. And so it's funny that you say that because they can see the growth in villains just as much as they can see growth in the princesses. And that really affects them as well.
I think there needs to be creativity in whatever you do. So a sequel can be a good sequel, but it has to be creative and not sort of make a whole film out of a little, you know, something detail in the story. So yes, I see a lot of question, and somebody's asking about the xenophobic. Let's see, how Disney could reform this. Yes, so I'm going to, Sima is asking these questions, and I think, once again, I would like to give the example of Moana, because in that case, they send a team to the Pacific Islands for 3 weeks. They collected stories, they interviewed people, they looked at sceneries, etc. Then they hired anthropologists or people who are, they hired cinematographers who do indigenous movies from about the Pacific Islanders. They brought them on board. And it was a process over 3 years, I think. And there was a lot of back and forth because sometimes Disney would say, oh, we want Moana to have a headgear. I can't remember what it was. And the anthropologist would say, no, this is strictly for a queen and it's on occasion of a funeral or something like that. And he would say, no, never mind. We want, to see that. Well, big fights. And it would take maybe 3 months for it to be resolved, but that the person, the consultant, would succeed in the end in trying to convince them of the inaccuracies, and that's and then a very famous musician basically imposed himself and his band, saying, "You're not going to do a movie about Pacific Islanders without having authentic music." And so they brought in that band that represented different islands from that region, and they did the music. So just to show that yes, absolutely they can do that. So in the case of Aladdin, it's totally true what you're saying, because I watched it again last night and then a few days ago, because I'm teaching it next week, and it's they see Arab culture as a monolith. So you have a little bit of Egypt here with the Sphinx or the pyramids, and you have a little bit of India there with a spiritual person, or you see a fakir, or you have Turkey with your fakir on the spikes, or it's just I was feeling uncomfortable seeing it, that being all treated in a comic mode, all these stereotypes piled on top of each other, just supposed to represent one culture when they cover, maybe half of the world. This was, yes, this cannot happen again. But Aladdin is 99, so they could not make another Aladdin like this. They would have.
That actually brings up a good question that someone asked. I think that's probably going to have to be one of our last as we're winding down. But do you think the old era of the Disney movies should be banned? And this kind of brings up that accountability culture, cancel culture, and with Dr. Seuss and all that stuff right now, since so many people are arguing about it, does it help to reflect on them and to grow from them? I mean, how can you ban Disney?
Okay, I am against canceling cultural texts. So I'm a great fan, for instance, of Dr. Seuss. Great fan. I understand that there are problematic, pieces, but it would be better to talk about them and to perhaps continue circulating them, but with a preface, maybe in them, explaining, that it. when it was conceived, well, it was already racist, but it was more accepted, or maybe the audience was not the one that was targeted, whose racist comments, what the racist comments were not addressed at the audience that was reading them. So these type of things, I know, the Tom and Jerry and all that. It's strictly my personal opinion that we cannot do that. And I'm a cultural studies specialist coming from literature. I've read things that were very shocking from, the 17th, 18th century. I think everything can be said, everything can be shown, not to children, but you need to be educated about what you consume. And this is exactly why I'm teaching a course on Disney, because I know that you all love Disney. I'll tell you how I started. I'm a fairy tale specialist, 17th and 18th century European fairy tale. That's my background. But then, when I would start teaching Cinderella, most of the students here would only know this Disney version of the story. I didn't get offended. I said, why don't we just study? Well, tell me which Cinderella you know, and I'll tell you what the original Cinderella is. And let's compare and let's try to understand why there's been such an evolution. Why does it make sense for Disney to have turned their Cinderella the way they did, and so on and so forth. So the more you know about the context or the origins, the better equipped you are to take a critical distance, and just, you may in the end decide to enjoy Disney for pure entertainment. So when I was watching Aladdin again last night, I actually really enjoyed it for the entertainment aspect. I love the songs and the humor sometimes. The first time I watched it a few days before, I was so much into what I had read about the racial prejudices that I was shocked, and I really didn't like it. So if I can give a conclusion or give a lesson here, do not turn your back on Disney films. Do not question yourself or your own taste as to, why did I like that when I was a kid, or why do I still like? It's perfectly fine. You're entitled to like anything you want. But the next time you watch it, you just watch it with a different eye. And it doesn't mean that you're going to hate it from now on. No, but you'll just appreciate it for what it is.
Well, this has been so helpful, and I'm so sorry there were so many amazing questions, but
I know, I am terribly sorry for all these.
But that just means they have to take your wonderful class and come to
exactly. You've got to come, and I'm telling you, this Disney course is growing and growing. So this is becoming my signature, because I had no idea people would so want to talk about these movies that they grew up with. And of course, I understand it. We all like to revisit things from our childhood. But now you're young adults. I always told my students, now you're a young adult, and it's really nice to reflect back and see what you think about.
Start fascinating conversations. Thank you so much. We're going to wind down our webinar, and thank you everyone to joining us. And if you have any more questions, come to Stony Brook and sign up for Dr. Reynard Leroux's class. Thank you, everybody, and have a
Thank you, everybody. And my apology if I could not address every single questions.
Thank you.